This is Doug McIntyre, one of the editors at ClimateCrisis247, and David Calloway, the other editor, is here with me. We're going to talk about the Securities and Exchange Commission and what's going on there with regard to climate change.
Yeah. So, Doug, the next week, the Securities and Exchange Commission is expected to vote on new climate disclosure rules. Those are rules that public companies under its remit will have to report the climate emissions that they make. And this rule has been more than 2 years in the making since the SEC proposed it. For the last year, it's been under major controversy because there's been this rise in anti-climate activities, particularly by red state politicians who believe it's a woke attempt to take over the country and force government down everyone's throats. And so they're battling it. And the SEC's kind of stayed hidden. Meanwhile, every other country in Europe and around the world has come out with its own climate disclosure laws. At the center of the controversy is something called Scope 3 reporting. If you're a big company, let's take Walmart, right? Walmart can report on the energy that it uses to keep its stores going, the lights, the air conditioning, the human activity, its carbon footprint. That's scope 1. It can report on the energy that it buys to keep its stuff going, and the electricity that it buys, for instance, and how that is made. So if it buys electricity from a utility that gets most of it from oil, right, it will report that. That's scope 2. Scope 3 is the most controversial. Scope 3 is the energy in its supply chain. So all of the vendors that serve Walmart, what their emissions add up to, Walmart would need to report in Scope 3. And that's where the controversy is, because big companies are screaming, and the business, the Chamber of Commerce, U.S. Chamber of Commerce, is screaming that it's just another government regulation. It's going to put onerous duties on accountants and stuff at these companies. And the problem is that Scope 3 emissions are the vast majority of emissions of any company. In Walmart's case, for instance, they're 95% of the emissions that it's responsible for. And you can argue whether it's responsible for them or not, right? Or whether it's vendors. But a lot of these companies have already been working to clean up their Scope 3 emissions. Apple, for instance, has told all the folks, the companies it works with in China that make its iPhones, that they have to work to clean up their emissions. Walmart has taken 1 billion tons of carbon out of its emissions in Scope 3. Anyway, this is the controversy. The SEC had Scope 3 reporting in its original rules. Now it's expected to take it out for the rules that it comes, which will make the U.S. essentially the weakest climate disclosure reporting regime in the world. And it's a fascinating study into how parts of the Biden government might be backing down from controversial climate issues because they don't want to create new issues for the Trump folks to bang them over the head with.
This is a real rookie question, but how do you measure the energy use of the people you do business with?
You will require them to do it.
I see.
As a prerequisite for them to do business with you.
I got it. So they give it to you, you gather it,
exactly.
You give it to the government.
Exactly. So it's basically, not a lot of us focused on supply chains until COVID. Then it became a very serious issue when suddenly we weren't getting enough eggs and toilet paper. But now, supply chains are a huge climate issue too. And it's not enough anymore to just say, we get our electricity from oil companies. People want to know why not? Why aren't you using clean energy? So it's going to become a bigger and bigger issue. And what the SEC and Commissioner Gary Gensler are doing, if in fact they vote on the rules without Scope 3, is kind of admitting that U.S. politics has once again taken over a serious climate move.
If you look at the SEC, I mean, when it was started and they put Joseph Kennedy in charge of it the first time, which never made any sense to me that you'd take a robber baron and say, you're the right guy to run the SEC.
Exactly.
But the SEC really exists for investors. So if I'm an investor and I look to the SEC as sort of my government servant, why do I care about whether the SEC gathers this data and gives it to me?
Right. And the data is wanted by investors. More than half of the companies in the Fortune 500, i.e., large companies, are already gathering scope 1, 2, and 3 data because investors want it. It shows that if they're cutting their emissions, they're cutting costs in many ways too by going to cheaper renewable energy. It's a material fact. And you can see some of the companies like Walmart, reaching new highs and stuff as they do this. But inside the crazy world of Washington, where politics and culture wars dominate, it's seen on one side as essentially big government trying to distract business from its ability to make money. And free market. So that's the case here. If you just ask investors, most would say they want the information.
Now, is this at war with places like Florida, where the attitude is, look, if you invest based on information like this, you cannot do business with the state of Florida?
Yeah,
So, I mean,
exactly.
is this sort of part of that wild chain that goes back to treasurers in some of these states where it's like, if don't give me that information, because if you do, I won't buy your shares.
That's exactly it. Yep. Or you cannot do
Yeah.
business with the Florida State Pension Fund, which is a giant pension fund, right? They're telling BlackRock and Barclays and JP Morgan, if you continue to push this climate investing, this ESG, environmental, social, and governance investing strategies, we're just simply not going to do business with you. And so it is these folks and their lawyers who are threatening to sue the SEC to block any climate disclosure rules if they include scope 3. So at some point, Gensler and the commissioners, the other folks on the governing board of the SEC, decided better to have weak climate reporting rules than none at all. And that appears to be where we're headed.
If you look at Europe, where obviously this is very different, I understand that a lot of investors want to know the answer to this, but is there a broader benefit when it comes to forcing these companies to do a better job in terms of climate change because the public has the information, not just as investors, but as basically just the general public as citizens?
Well, there's a broader environmental benefit. Some would argue that if you look at European markets and indexes, they consistently underperform the US and would point to that as a reason, right? And who knows, maybe they have a point, but certainly Europe is more overly regulated than the US. And they do not have these culture wars to the extent that we do. They do have, several right-wing populist movements that are gaining ground and gaining traction and are starting to push against the climate agenda at the EU level because they're worried that it's going to slow down oil and gas use, which they say they need for, heat during the winter. So it's a fascinating struggle between kind of markets, government, and environmental movements, kind of culminating on these flashpoints like we're going to see next week with the SEC.
Is this a good example of how these battles are now moving into the courts? It seems like every time there's some huge dispute about the climate and money, it ends up in the court system someplace.
Yeah.
I mean, is this the future of fighting climate change? Is that it ends up in the court system?
I'm afraid it is. It already has. And it's going to get worse. The SEC will almost certainly be sued immediately when it releases its rules next week, if indeed it releases them next week. And there's going to be more court activity, and of course, all that does is slow things down.
Yeah. I will see you on the courthouse steps. Have
I
a
look
good
forward to
day
it.
and talk
All
to you
right.
soon.